Frank Yosa here, CEO of Ketone, and I'm really excited to have Mary Newport, MD, on the podcast today. I've listened to maybe 5 to 10 different podcasts and TED Talks that you've done, so I'm really excited to be able to ask my own set of questions and go in a little bit deeper into certain things that I've heard in your podcast that I really, find fascinating.
So nice that you're having me on here, Frank. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I met you a couple of weeks ago at the Metabolic Conference, and we've talked so much on the phone that I realized, wait a second, this is the first time I think I actually met you in person, wasn't it?
Well, I think maybe about 3 years ago, we might have met in person at the same conference when it was in Tampa.
That's right. You're right. In Tampa. Yeah, we did meet at the conference. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, briefly.
Well, you have a new book out called, I don't want to butcher the name, The Complete Guide to Ketones.
Here it is.
The Complete Book of Ketones.
Complete Book of Ketones, a practical guide to ketogenic diets and ketone supplements.
All right. Well, so let's start with your background,
okay.
And how you got into everything ketone and coconut related.
Okay. So I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, as did my husband, and went to Xavier University for undergrad, University of Cincinnati Medical School, did my training in pediatrics at Children's Hospital Medical Center in Cincinnati, and then my fellowship in neonatology in Charleston, South Carolina. And neonatology is the care of sick and premature newborns. So I spent 30 years working in newborn intensive care units in Florida. And now I do home visits with people that have chronic illnesses. It's really an interesting, at the opposite end of the spectrum kind of a job. But my husband, Steve, was an accountant, and that worked out really great for our family because when we, came time to have children, he suggested, why doesn't he work from home for my practice? And that worked great because he could be home with my kids. Our kids, when I ran out for emergencies. So he took care of us, and he made it possible for me to be a mother and a doctor.
Great.
Yeah. So what happened with Steve was when he was only 51 years old, he started having very obvious symptoms of memory impairment. He would miss appointments. Even if I called him a half hour ahead of time, he would forget, to go. And he started making big payroll mistakes. Really big payroll mistakes, like $4,000 mistakes.
Wow.
And procrastinating on getting these quarterly taxes done that should take about 20 minutes. He would, take days to get organized and miss deadlines. And then he started forgetting if he'd been to the bank and the post office. And that I felt clearly was not normal. I'm 2 years younger than him, and I thought I wouldn't forget if I had been to the bank and the post office, but he did. And so at that point, he was also depressed, and the doctor thought it was depression related, memory impairment, but then he kept getting worse. He just kept getting worse and couldn't find his way around, couldn't read a map anymore, just things he clearly had been able to do, he couldn't. And so when he was 54, he was officially diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease. And you can imagine that was devastating because, we thought we'd get to retire together, spend our golden years together, and the average length, of lifespan after diagnosis for Alzheimer's is about 7 years. And if you have early onset, it's usually shorter than that. So it completely changed our lives for us and our children, and who were teenagers at the time. So anyway, he just continued to spiral downwards. By 2006, he had to stop driving, and and later in 2006, he couldn't even remember how to turn a computer on, even though he had been on one all day long. He had stopped reading. He was very physically active up to that point, and he liked kayaking. I was frightened that he would get lost out there in the ocean, in the Gulf of Mexico, actually.
Wow.
So there were so many things he had to really quit doing because of his dementia, and he was always aware of it. He knew he had Alzheimer's, he knew he had dementia, and he knew what he could do and what he could no longer do. So very frustrating and very depressing for him and all of us. The way I got involved with this whole subject of ketones and ketogenic diets starts in 2008. And at this point, Steve was about 7 years into, the obvious symptoms of Alzheimer's, and not doing well at all. He barely could talk in the morning, finish sentences. He was very lethargic. He had tremors in his face when he would try to talk, and had trouble, completing his thoughts and sentences. And he had a tremor in his hand when he tried to eat. And just simple things like getting water out of the dispenser in the refrigerator. He couldn't figure that out anymore. He couldn't figure out how to get a spoon instead of a knife out of the drawer. Very not doing well at all. And 2 clinical trials came along, and we were always looking for these, but they were very few and far between. And there were 2 drugs, 2 different, one was an oral medication, one was a vaccine, that were aimed at reducing plaque in the brain, which is one of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. You accumulate all this plaque and then develop tangles. And so that was, the big thrust of the drug companies, to try to find medications that would reduce plaque in the brain. And he was scheduled for 2 days in a row to try out for these 2 clinical trials. And the night before the first, screening, I got on the internet to look at the risks and benefits of the 2 drugs that he was going to try out for. And I just happened upon a press release for a medical food. It didn't have a name at that point, but ultimately it was called Axona. And it was still about a year away from coming out. And they had done a pilot study and then a longer 6-month study of 153 people, showing that almost half of the people with Alzheimer's that took it had improvement in their memory and cognition. And with the pilot study, it was a single dose that they took, and 90 minutes later, they had improvements. And so it was quite astounding. And they didn't say in the press release what it was or how it worked. So I decided to dig further, and I was lucky to find their patent application.
Yeah, I find that absolutely brilliant to go through the patents to look for where the future of everything is. Because talk more about going into the patents.
Yeah. So it turns out they had filed the first patent in the year 2000, and I think it was triggered by Dr. Richard Veech's work. He had been working on ketones, and he published a study just days before this patent went in. And it was about the neuroprotective effect of ketones. They had done studies of cultures of neurons from areas of the brain that were affected by Alzheimer's and by Parkinson's. So these were separate cultures of brain cells. And to some of them, they added ketone, and to the controls, they didn't. And they subjected these neurons to toxins that cause Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. And what they found was that there were many more surviving neurons in the cultures that had the ketone, beta hydroxybutyrate, and that the neurons were bigger and they had more outgrowth, of dendrites. So they concluded that it was neuroprotective, and Dr. Veech and several of his associates went on to write hypothesis papers about how ketones could potentially help diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and ALS and MS and all of this. So Dr. Henderson, right around that same time, filed a patent to look at MCT oil. And Dr. Henderson's mother died of Alzheimer's. So and he also was ApoE4, which is a higher risk of Alzheimer's, developing Alzheimer's disease. So he had the idea to use MCT oil. And the reason why this would help is because when you consume MCT oil, your liver converts part of it to ketones. And so
And what is MCT oil? Let's do a quick little recap.
Yeah. So MCT oil is medium chain triglyceride oil. And so there are different sizes of fatty acids, and the medium chains are kind of on the small side of that. And they're ketogenic. So when you consume medium chain triglycerides, they are mostly taken to the liver, and they're converted either to ketones, or the rest of it is used directly as fuel by mitochondria. It's not stored as fat. So they're very unique compared to the larger, heavier fatty acids. And the interesting thing that I didn't know before I read their patent application was that MCT oil is extracted usually from coconut or palm kernel oil. The reason I was familiar with MCT oil at all is because as a neonatologist, we used to add it to the feedings of our tiniest premature newborn. So we're talking babies under 2 pounds. We would add it to each of their feedings and they would absorb it very well and they would get home faster. And so I knew what it was. And then the formula manufacturer started making special premature formulas and added it directly to the formulas. And one of the reasons they were doing that is because breast milk contains medium chain triglycerides, and they were trying to mimic the fats in breast milk. So they, if you look at any infant formula, pretty much anywhere in the world, I've been all over the world now and looked in stores at infant formulas. Many of them have MCT oil, but nearly all of them have coconut and or palm kernel oil, and they're literally trying to mimic the fats in breast milk.
Yeah, I think when I adopted my baby and we were giving them store-bought milk, I remember texting you about, can I add some coconut oil? And you were like, MCT oil specifically.
Yeah.
You're like, absolutely. Obviously not too much, but just to get a little bit of the fats in there.
Right. And, when I think of a 2-pound baby getting 1 ml like 12 times a day, because we would feed them every 2 hours. I mean, that's quite substantial.
That's a lot, actually. That's a lot more than I would have.
And they tolerated it very well. So why would ketones help somebody with Alzheimer's? So what I learned in this patent application was something new about Alzheimer's, was that it is a type of diabetes of the brain. And I had not ever heard that expression before. And basically, they presented the studies showing that there's decreased glucose uptake in the brain with that can be seen on with MRIs and PET scans, mainly with a glucose uptake PET scan. And a group at Brown University had done studies on the brains of people who died with late stage Alzheimer's. They did this first, and they were people that did not have type 1 or type 2 diabetes, but they found that the brain had deficiency of insulin, poor glucose uptake, and insulin resistance. There were signs of that in the brains, and then they called it type 3 diabetes. So you may hear that expression from time to time. And then they looked at people who had died at all stages of the disease, and they found that it started in a particular area of the brain, in the hippocampus area, which has to do with memory, and that it slowly spreads throughout the brain until it's widespread and very severe in the last stages of Alzheimer's. So, glucose needs insulin to get into brain cells. And if there's insulin resistance, glucose just simply isn't getting in. And so, one question has been, are the cells dead or incapable of taking up glucose, or are they just simply lacking in fuel? And there have been several studies now showing that it's most likely that they are there and capable of taking up fuel, because 3 different techniques, the most recent being ketone PET scan, has shown that ketone uptake is normal in those very same areas of the brain that don't take up glucose normally. So So
it's like the ketones are able to bypass this blockage that's occurring and not allowing the fuel source to get in there.
Yeah.
Everyday normal people that eat at McDonald's every day aren't even getting, a fraction of any ketones. Maybe in the morning when they wake up, they might just start getting some, but then the moment they have breakfast, it's all gone. So they're not even being exposed to it at all.
Right. And it's because we've gone to this very relatively high carbohydrate diet here in the US, and that has spread all throughout the world. Many areas of the world have adopted a Western type diet. So ketones don't need insulin to get into brain cells. And the apparatus for using ketones, which means the enzymes, the chemical pathways, are present already in the fetus very early on. A newborn who is strictly breastfed goes into ketosis within hours of birth. And they use, a mother who breastfeeds knows that it takes several days for the milk to really start coming in. There's hardly anything there. But human newborns are fat compared to other mammals. And the breast milk that they are getting has medium chain triglycerides in it. So they start burning fat as fuel and use these medium chains. And go into ketosis.
I didn't realize that there was a lack of food for them, so they're
Right.
basically going into ketosis, doing a little 7-day fast with
Right.
minimal food in there until the supply comes in. I
So
didn't.
the supply comes in, yeah. So that's probably why human newborns are fat. I mean, other mammals are really thin; they have almost no fat when they're born, which is really interesting. But this is unique, and from an evolutionary point of view, the people that have studied this, like Dr. Stephen Cunnane, feel that the big brain of humans compared to other animals, because it has such a high energy requirement, that through the course of evolution, this ability to use ketones helped us get to where we are today in this point of evolution. The fat baby being able to burn fat as fuel and provide ketones to the brain as fuel helps us basically survive newbornhood. And the other thing he has found, before he studied Alzheimer's, he actually studied newborns. DHA and fats and all of that. And one of the things they learned is that these heavier fats that don't cross easily into the brain are actually converted to ketones. And the ketones become not only the fuel for the brain, but also the building blocks for cholesterol and the other lipids in the brain in the newborn.
Wow.
So ketones are extremely important in the newborn. And a pregnant woman who's breastfeeding or pregnant goes naturally into ketosis. They are naturally in ketosis. And women go into ketosis much quicker than men do. And infants and children much, much quicker than adults. They'll go into ketosis if they're fasting or starving. So it's, ketones are extraordinarily important throughout our life. And this is just something that's really come to be known since about the 1990s. 80s and 90s, they did some of the studies with the fetus and the newborn, but not much happened with it. What they didn't really use that information so much. And there were only a couple people that ever connected the idea of using ketones for Alzheimer's briefly, but nothing came of it, in like the 1980s. And then Dr. Veech came along in the 90s, and when he had his landmark study for neurons, that's really, I think, the trigger for developing this idea that ketones could potentially be therapeutic for somebody with Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's and ALS and these other neurodegenerative diseases that have a problem of glucose uptake in the brain. It's true of many neurologic diseases, progressive diseases, autism, children with Down syndrome, people with bipolar disease, schizophrenia, PTSD. They have areas of the brain that do not take up glucose normally. So, the therapeutic benefits of ketones, it's conceivable that increasing ketones in the blood, by some route could help, people with these conditions.
Wow. So let's go back to your husband's story. So you read about, you read the patent that mentioned MCT Oil, and I think you just drove to your local grocery store and just started like that.
Yeah. Well, so I read about this on the internet, and it was getting to be about 1 a.m. because I'm like really, this was a 75-page document and with many references, and I'm like learning everything I can about ketones at this point. So he was scheduled to screen at 9 a.m. and this is about 1 a.m. So I didn't have any time to do time to do anything about it, before his first screening. And so we ended up having a day before and a day after he started coconut oil testing by, objective testing by, outside sources, not me testing him. So we went for the clinical screening, and he hadn't taken anything special at that point. And we were at University of South Florida, and he, we were in St. Pete for another drug, but he needed to score at least 16 points on a 30-point memory test to qualify. They were looking for people with mild to moderate Alzheimer's. And he scored only 14 points and needed 16, so he didn't qualify. He met all the other criteria. So this was very distressing. And the doctor had him draw a clock. She said there's a clock test for Alzheimer's. And instead of a big circle with the numbers around it, he drew several small circles and about 4 numbers in a very random pattern. And she said, this is very disorganized here. He's on the verge of severe Alzheimer's, she told me. And so I thought, what do we have to lose? I had just read all this about MCT oil and that it was extracted from coconut oil the night before. So, and I knew I could get coconut oil. So I got that at a health food store. We did that on the way home. And when we got
So
home,
you did that literally on the way home from the study.
literally on the way home,
Wow.
on the way home. And we knew he was going to be tested the next day again. You know, this was our great hope that he would get one of these drugs that were going to be a cure for Alzheimer's, you know, these clinical trials. And when we got home, I had to kind of refresh my memory about freshman biochemistry. What are medium chain triglycerides? And then I was able to find on the USDA website the fatty acid composition of coconut oil. And I learned that it was about 60% medium chain triglycerides. So these are C6, C8, C10, C12. And the C means how many carbons are there in the chain. So these are really short, relatively short fatty acids. But
and just to jump in real quickly, the C8 is the strongest one that's on the market right now. I think the C6,
C6 is more ketogenic, but it tastes horrible, I'm told. And people are just really starting to study that, but they're finding that C6 is the most ketogenic, but it's also the most bad tasting.
But I don't think it's commercially available. I've never tried it.
No, it's not really commercially available. So C8 is the most ketogenic of C8, C10, C12. And so Axona, the product, the medical food I was reading about, is C8, and they pick C8 because it's the most ketogenic. Most of the MCT oils out there are mostly C8 and C10, like a 60 to 40% ratio, with a tiny bit of C6 and a little bit of C12 that kind of come along in the process when they're making it. So we're talking probably less than 3% of the fats are C6 and C12. Anyway, what I learned was, that what I calculated was that coconut oil has 60% medium chains, and that should be equal to what's in the medical food. But it actually has a much lower percent of C8. But I didn't know a lot at that point, and I thought, okay, so I'll give him. I figured out that 60% MCTs would equal a little over 2 tablespoons, 35 grams of coconut oil. And so the next day, he was scheduled in the early afternoon, around 1 in the afternoon, to be screened for that next clinical trial. And so at breakfast, I gave him a little over 2 tablespoons in his coconut oil that I put into oatmeal, because coconut oil is a little like thick and solid at room temperature.
Yeah.
And I took it too, and I have to say I got major indigestion from taking that much. I have no gallbladder. So, I was like, ugh, luckily he wasn't sick at all. It didn't bother him at all. And so we were in a different city and a different facility. And when they took him away to test him, came back, and he didn't think he had done very well. But the nurse comes back and she starts taking his blood pressure, and she's talking about drawing blood. And I said, well, wait a minute, what happened? And she says, oh, didn't he tell you he scored 18 and he qualified for the study? So he gained 4 points from the day before. And it was interesting because it was a day of the week, which was different. I mean, it was the same season. He knew the season, but he couldn't remember the season the day before. He couldn't even come up with the word spring the day before.
Wow.
And he knew what city we were in, which was different, and what floor we were on in the facility, which was different from the day before. And he gained 4 points and he qualified for the study. So, we were elated and didn't know at that point, was it really the coconut oil or was it just really good luck or prayers, or what was it, But I thought, we're going to keep this going and see what happens. And so, from that day on, I started giving them at least 2 tablespoons every morning, but I started also cooking with it. I read everything I could get my hands on about coconut and coconut oil and got recipes, cookbooks. And even the next day I started adding more at different times of the day because, right away I thought, well, this medical food is 20 grams of MCT oil. And even in their studies, they would talk about how it peaked at 90 minutes. But then, it was gone after like 3 hours. The ketones were gone. And I thought, well, what does your brain do the other 21 hours of the day?
Right.
I have to take a little sip of water here.
Yeah.
I've been talking too much lately.
Well, we appreciate it.
Yeah. So, basically, I felt like he needed it at other meals, potentially throughout the day and maybe in the evening to try to keep ketones available to his brain as much as possible. So I started actually talking with Dr. Richard Veech at that point, and I think probably around the fourth or fifth day, it was so obvious that he was doing better. Steve, he was much more alert. He was more talkative. He was finishing sentences. His face had more animation in it. People with Alzheimer's often have kind of a dead look. He was back to whistling again, and the tremors had virtually disappeared, very quickly over several days. His hand would tremor sometimes a little bit in the morning before he had the coconut oil, but after 20 or 30 minutes, that would stop. And his depression lifted. He said it was like the light bulb came on in his brain the day he started coconut oil, which was fascinating. He said that many times. And, he felt like he had hope for his future, and, his depression lifted very quickly. And so I remember calling Dr. Veech, because he was in Wikipedia and in the patent application as the world's expert on ketones. And I was just shocked when I called him and he picked up the phone himself, which was quite amazing. And I told him, I didn't tell him what I was doing with Steve. And I said, theoretically, do you think coconut oil could help somebody with Alzheimer's because of the ketone effect? And he said, no, he didn't really think so. He didn't think the levels could get high enough. And he told me he had that conversation with Dr. Henderson about, this medical food, about MCT oil, like several years earlier. And he just didn't think the levels would be high enough. He thought you needed much higher levels, probably 10 times higher, to help somebody with Alzheimer's. And he told me about his ketone ester and how he wasn't getting funding, for mass production and clinical studies, and how urgent that was. And so 2 weeks after Steve started the coconut oil, he drew another clock, and this time it had the whole circle and all the numbers in place around it. And it had about 1 million hands of the clock in there, but much, much more complex and more organized. And I faxed those to Dr. Veech, and then got him on the phone again. And he said, well, this is unexpected. That was his word, unexpected. And he wanted to know everything. I told him what we were doing, and it was just coconut oil at that point. He was really shocked. He didn't, I'm not sure he knew that MCT oil was extracted from coconut oil, but he was very familiar with MCT oil, and I'm pretty sure that they were using it in his lab studying C8, especially at that point. And he actually then did send me some C8 to try with Steve. And I was able to get a leader from the Stepan company that makes it to try it in different foods. I thought, this may have something to it. And I didn't know I could get it on Amazon. It was in some health food stores, the ones that cater to bodybuilders, that you could already get MCT oil for years at that point, I found out. So we measured Steve's levels at one point. Dr. Veech said, let's measure his levels. And this was really a couple months later after we started the coconut oil. And we found that the ketone level, and he measured beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate. They did it directly there at the NIH. We had my lab at the hospital I worked at cooperated very nicely with drawing these samples, sent them, prepared them and sent them, I think, with dry ice, to Dr. Veech, and they ran the levels very quickly. And he found that the level with coconut oil, the total ketone level peaked at about 3 hours after taking it. And it just kind of came back almost, but not quite to baseline, 6 or 7 hours after the peak, which was interesting. And that day, we actually gave him 2 doses at breakfast and then at dinner. And at dinner, his levels went up even higher, but we're still going up when we stopped taking them 3 hours later, on the rise. So we don't know how high his level actually got. And then a couple weeks later, he said, let's do this just with C8,
Well, what were the numbers? Did I miss?
Well, the total combined ketone level was like 0.35. I mean, it wasn't very high. That was after breakfast. And after dinner, it was getting close to, I think it was 0.45, but it was heading up,
And he was not on a ketogenic diet, right? I mean,
not really.
had you even looked into that concept at all, or he was just
Not so much at that point. Not so much. I was just starting to read a little bit about it. I knew of it from medical school, that it was used for childhood epilepsy. And I had a patient when I was a resident, a child that was on the ketogenic diet for epilepsy. So I knew a little bit about it, but I mean, it had been years earlier, that since I had even really thought about it. And we were eating a Mediterranean diet for a couple of years at that point, much lower carb than what we had been used to. We went to a whole food.
Okay, so you were low carb.
We were already
somewhat low carb. I mean, that's important.
Lower carb. I'd say, it could have still been 100 or maybe 120 grams a day, but much, much less than we had been eating up until about 2006,
Okay.
And then I had read a study about the Mediterranean diet, that the people who were on the most Mediterranean diet with Alzheimer's lived 4 years longer on average than the people that were on the least Mediterranean diet. And that was when I thought, what? Nutrition could have something to do with this? What we eat could have something to do with this. So we both went on a Mediterranean diet, and I ended up losing weight. And Steve, but he kept getting worse anyway over 2 years. I mean, it didn't keep him from, I have no idea. Did it slow it down? Did it help in any way? No idea. Oh, sorry about that. I'll wait till it stops ringing.
All right, continue.
Okay. So, basically we were on a Mediterranean diet when we started this. Andy was taking DHA. He was taking about 900 milligrams a day of DHA because there was going to be a study for Alzheimer's. And I thought, do we really want to get the placebo for an omega-3 fatty acid that we know is essential? It didn't make sense to me. So I thought, we'll just put them on the dose that they're going to use in the study. So he had been on that for a couple of years too at that point. But the thing that changed was starting coconut oil, and it was dramatic. It was, now we talk about people who are slow responders versus dramatic responders. And fortunately, Steve was a dramatic responder, that we saw something right away.
Explain that. You find that some people, I hadn't heard of that concept of, people immediately noticing something versus others.
Right. And, okay, so I started thinking, if Steve responds to this, other people are going to respond too. And there are like 35 million people in the world dealing with Alzheimer's, plus their families. And I need to get this message out there. And so I wrote an article that ended up going viral, and then it turned into a regional newspaper article that Dr. Veech was even interviewed for, and that went viral. And so I started hearing back from other people. And the next person I heard back from was probably maybe 6 months after I wrote the article. And she told me that her mother was 83. She lived in Connecticut. Her mother was 83 and had Alzheimer's, and she was in bed. She wasn't recognizing them. She was barely talking. She wasn't eating very well. They felt like they were losing her fast, and she thought, what do we have to lose, like I did? They started giving her coconut oil, and it wasn't immediate for her. But she said over 2 months, she slowly improved, and she started eating better, started recognizing them, and then she started getting out of bed and talking better. And by 2 months, she was back to reading the newspaper, sitting at the kitchen table. And then she got into the refrigerator, and they thought she was getting in trouble. And she says, I'm looking for that Pepperidge Farm cake that we bought yesterday. So, I mean, she had a dramatic improvement, but over 2 months. It wasn't like immediate like Steve, that there was some obvious changes.
Wow.
So many people are like that, so people say, well, how long should we try this before we give up? And I tell people, give it a good 3 months. If you see absolutely nothing, then it may not work for this person. But if they're not getting worse either at the end of 3 months, it might be doing something. It might be slowing it down, possibly.
So how much coconut oil or MCT oil combination do you suggest? How many, do you have like a protocol somewhere, a certain number of tablespoons?
Yeah, it's kind of as much as a person can tolerate. So the thing with MCT oil is that some people, even the first time they take it, even 1 teaspoon, they'll end up with diarrhea, and that's very common, especially with C8. If you find pure C8, it's more common with that. But so Dr. Veech, after we did Steve's levels, and then we did them with MCT oil, just one dose, and his level did peak at 90 minutes, went down, it was gone at 3 hours, the ketone levels. He was like, just keep pushing it till he pukes and has diarrhea, he said. So, but, I felt like he improved with coconut oil. I'm going to keep coconut oil in the mix too, because there might be something else about it that we don't know yet,
Like you said, antibacterial or?
Oh, several things. Okay, so lauric acid is half of coconut oil, and it's a medium chain, but it's on the heavier end of that scale. And so lauric acid is very antimicrobial. It kills all kinds of viruses, bacteria, fungus, protozoa, and some of these have been implicated as possible causes of or contributors to Alzheimer's. Such as the herpes simplex virus. It causes fever blisters. Many people have fever blisters, and this virus lives in nerves that originate in the same area of the brain where Alzheimer's starts. And they've studied this extensively. I mean, there are probably over 100 studies on herpes simplex and Alzheimer's disease. Well, lauric acid dissolves the lipid capsule and kills the herpes simplex virus. So, I felt like for Steve, who had constant fever blisters, that this would be a good strategy to keep, the coconut oil and lauric acid. He had an infection of fever blisters around his eye when he was 29 years old, and he was really sick when that happened. And I always felt, and he said he never felt the same after that, cognitively speaking. And so, I felt like that may have been the trigger for him to get early onset.
Right.
Herpes simplex.
So what do you think? You tell people to do 2 or 3 tablespoons of coconut oil and start with a teaspoon of C8 throughout the day, and then slowly increase the C8 until you have diarrhea for a few weeks?
Well, I tell people, they can use coconut and or MCT oil. So everybody finds, some people do better with coconut, some do better with MCT. A lot of people mix it now. And we started mixing it with Steve. And I kind of did a 4-to-3 ratio, 4 parts MCT to 3 parts coconut oil. So that would be like 4 ounces of MCT to 3 ounces of coconut oil, and mixing it, and it stays liquid at room temperature. You can use it in almost any food. So we just started pushing it. And I tell people to start with a half to 1 teaspoon, maybe twice a day with food. Make sure they have it with food. They're more likely to tolerate it. And then, slowly increase it, like every few days, maybe increase it by that amount every 2 or 3 days, and work up to as much as they can handle. For Steve, it ended up being quite a lot. We were in the 9 to 10 tablespoons a day range of coconut and MCT oil, like the combination of those two. Or sometimes I use whole coconut oil to cook, depending on what we were doing with the meals. Many people find that they can tolerate at least 3 to 5 tablespoons a day. And one of the rationales recently, Dr. Stephen Cunnane he's been doing a study with mild cognitive impairment and ketone PET scans, and he's found that 30 grams a day actually does help, does increase ketone uptake in the brain of MCT oil, 30 mLs, which is 2 tablespoons.
2 tablespoons of the C8?
This is C8C10 that they use.
Oh, the blend, okay.
They found so many people didn't tolerate C8 that they decided to use the blend. But they also feel from their studies that 3 tablespoons a day would be even better, that it probably would do more to fill in that brain energy gap that they talk about. So
if you would do everything all over again, if you had the opportunity, would you have also done that alongside a ketogenic diet? Is that what you proposed?
Well, yeah. Eventually, I would say Steve ended up on a ketogenic diet by virtue of how much fat he was taking. And the other thing we saw was that he stopped craving fruit. Like part of the Mediterranean diet, fruit is, pretty big, and they don't, tell you to limit fruit, on a Mediterranean diet. But he would stand at the sink before we started doing this and eat so many pieces of fruit. I couldn't keep enough fruit in the house. It was amazing. And after we started this, almost immediately he stopped doing that.
Yeah,
It was, the brain was craving
When I talk to people about the ketogenic diet, fruit is the number one obstacle. People are
Right.
addicted to it.
Yeah.
They think that it's healthy, which it might be healthy for certain circumstances. But if you're trying to get into a ketogenic diet, fruit is the devil, and they just can't get over that concept. They're always like, well, what about strawberries? What about, can I squeeze in some of these? Like, yeah, maybe after a few months you get used to it. You can put in some berries.
Factor it in, a few berries, but not much. And so it's a good thing to get away.
I mean, if you were to test your blood sugar and have a Snickers bar or have, a pineapple, whether one's organic or not doesn't matter. Your blood sugar is still going to spike the exact same way, and that is the problem. You have a blood sugar spike, and what does that do, for your brain?
Right. So, and then he just started leaving the bread and the pasta behind. He just wasn't eating as much of that stuff. And then, at that point, I'm learning more about the ketogenic diet. So I just started not putting it on his plate. He was perfectly happy to have a like cheese or a roll up, with, like I would get this, the natural brands of, with no nitrites, of deli meats or whatever, and wrapped cheese. And he loved eating that kind of stuff. And just, not having the rice, pasta, potatoes, that kind of thing. So by virtue of how much fat he was getting, I'm sure he was on a ketogenic diet, probably within several months of when we started this.
Right. So then let's go back to, Dr. Veech. So you're talking to Dr. Veech. He's sending him flyers. And then where did you guys go with that relationship?
Yeah. So Steve continued to improve over about a year. His gait completely normalized. He was able to run again. He had a visual disturbance that went away after 3 or 4 months. I mean, he said it was like the words would shake on the page. And after 3 or 4 months, that stopped and he could read. And then 9 or 10 months, he could remember what he read several hours earlier. We're talking detailed stuff that he would recall. And then he kind of leveled off for a year.
Oh, sorry, did you end up getting the medication during this time?
No.
Okay, so you were not on that study.
Oh, okay. So yeah, he did qualify for study. He ended up qualifying for both studies eventually. And we found out he was on the placebo for the first 12 to 14 months. We later found that out.
But I think, so he was on the placebo for the first drug, but they were amazed that his scores were actually improving. So they thought that would like mess up all their data, because here's this placebo outlier.
Well, we knew that, and we told him that he was taking all this coconut oil and MCT oil. And that was about 2 months after that he qualified and started the study, a little over 2 months after he started the coconut oil. And they said, well, we don't see how food could screw up our study. So
I mean, you might have cost them millions of dollars in messing up their study with their placebos beating everyone else.
Right. So he was tested frequently throughout that first year, and he gained 6 points on this Alzheimer's disease assessment scale. And it later was published that people on the placebo lost an average of 6 points during that year. And he also improved by 14 points out of 78 on these activities of daily living. So this is how well you're able to do things for yourself, just everyday things like shaving and bathing and, getting food for yourself and all of that. He improved by 14 points, which was rather amazing that first year.
Wow.
And then the sad thing is that he crossed over. So this was a crossover study where after 12, they said anytime after a year, they would cross you over to the drug. And that's one of the reasons we chose the study, was because we knew eventually he'd be on the drug. Well, he was probably on it for 5 to 7 months. And we noticed his hair was growing out white, which is one of the known side effects of the drug. So we knew he was on it. And he started having these side effects. I don't know. He wasn't doing quite as well. He started doing some weird stuff like putting his clothes on backwards, having, confusion about that. And I had to start talking him through taking a shower. First you put, get your hair wet. Okay, now put the shampoo in your hair. Okay, now rinse it out. Talk him through the whole thing. It was like, what is going on? He was doing so well up to that point. And he, had wounds that wouldn't heal like for a month. He would nick himself shaving. It would bleed for several days, with this drug. And we're like, and, because I'm a doctor, I think they maybe said, the other people we think that are on it have all gotten worse in the last year. Wow. So, and then he fainted. There were a couple other things. And I said, okay, we're going to get him out of the study. So we did. So he probably got it for 5 to 7 months. And then we got a call a few months later saying that they had stopped the study completely because they found it caused accelerated worsening of Alzheimer's.
Oh.
It was devastating. It was like the coconut oil helped him get into the study that now accelerated Alzheimer's. And we were just fortunate he was not on the placebo the first year. We wouldn't even be talking, if that were the case. And so at that point, I'm still talking to Dr. Veech regularly. And he said, why don't we go ahead and try him with the ketone ester, Dr. Veech's ketone ester. So this is a combination of D-beta-hydroxybutyrate. There's 2 forms of beta-hydroxybutyrate, D and L, 2 different forms. And Dr. Veech says that it's really important to use the D form of beta-hydroxybutyrate because it's more bioavailable. It's the circulating form of beta-hydroxybutyrate. And so he, when in developing his ester, developed a product, even though it was more expensive, that was, predominantly D-beta-hydroxybutyrate. And then it's attached to also D-butanediol. And the cool thing about that is butanediol, after you ingest it, consume it, it's converted to more beta-hydroxybutyrate. So it's kind of a neat trick for keeping the beta-hydroxybutyrate levels sustained, keeping the level around longer. And
so what do you call that exact ketone ester? What do you call it?
I call it Dr. Veech's ketone ester. So it's a beta-hydroxybutyrate, D-beta-hydroxybutyrate, D-butanediol ketone ester, but it's Dr. Veech's ester.
Okay.
That's what we always called it, Dr. Veech's ester. And they had finished toxicity testing. It had been reported, and it was, I think, published at that point or about to be published. And so he felt that it would be safe then, to do a clinical trial of 1 person. And he could really only make enough for 1 person in his lab and be able to do the studies that they were doing there. And so they sent us the raw material. It was horrible tasting. It was, I knew that, we had actually visited his lab, Steve and I, a couple times at that point. We had tasted it and we're like, whoa, this is pretty bad. They were trying to do different things to flavor it. So I had to kind of figure out what to do to make it palatable for Steve, but he was a trooper. I mean, at this point, he still knew he had Alzheimer's. He was trying to fight it. He was gung-ho to do this. I mean, he gave full consent to do this. And so we started giving him, it was right around 20 grams 3 times a day the first couple days. And even the first 2 hours, we saw a remarkable improvement. I videotaped him when he took this dose, for a couple of hours. And one of the things that he did was he was able to say and write out the whole alphabet. And he hadn't been able to do that probably for months, maybe even longer than that. But the cool thing was he tried and tried and tried for about 20 minutes. He kept trying over and over. And just that he could stick to trying to do that. And then he was successful. He said the whole alphabet and he wrote it all out. It was, multiple attempts. And he was so proud of himself. He was euphoric. He was just in a great mood. He talked about his first grade teacher, Sister Anthony Ann, and cursed her for his abysmal penmanship. I mean, he had never mentioned her to me before. Wow. And he pulled her name out of a hat, which was just amazing. And the next day, he could do things already. He was back to being able to just shower, automatically without having to be talked through it. And he picked his clothes out of the closet. He put them on right. I mean, we saw some really quick changes.
I think I remember you telling me that he changed for the first time in how many months just by himself? How many months has it been since he had changed by himself?
It had been months, several months that he hadn't, that I'd had to kind of be there with him and help him, put his clothes on and that kind of thing. And over about 6 weeks, we saw reversal of almost all of the new things that we had seen, like he had started wandering from home, looking for his brothers that live 700 miles away and, those kind of scary things. And he quit doing all of that. And he was back to being able to do yard work again and vacuuming and to help me out, and dishes. He would help put the dishes away and sort them out, all the forks, knives, spoons in the right place. I mean, this kind of thing. And it was a good 20 months that he was stable, after that, after he started to keep taking the ketone ester before he had his next setback, which was related to another medication and an illness. It's a long story, but the ketone ester really dramatically turned him around. And we
and
saw.
You guys ended up writing a paper on that, right? With Veech?
Right. Yes. So I was the first author. I was blown away because here I am, an author on a paper with Dr. Richard Veech, Dr. Theodore Van Italy, Todd King, from their lab, and Dr. Kashiwaya, who had worked in their lab on this, the neuroprotective study. And it was like one of the biggest honors of my life, to get to work on this paper and, write. I wrote up the case report part. Dr. Van Italy, Veech, the others, had their input into their different sections of the paper. And it was
Todd King is amazing. Todd King doesn't get enough notice and notoriety. He is amazing.
I agree with that completely. And he just, I would let him know, we're going to run out of this in about a week or so. And he'd say, no problem. I'll get some in the mail to you right away, and it would, appear on our doorstep. And, we had this, for Steve, all this time.
Now you were giving him, in order to make it palatable, you came up with a concoction that had a decent amount of sugar in it.
Yeah.
That was 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or maybe the dual fuel helps, or what do you think?
It might have helped. It's hard to say. At the time, I hated doing that, but I tried everything you could think of to try to flavor it with what, you can get in your home. And I ended up trying SodaStream concentrate. It's used to make, carbonated beverages. People use it for that. And they have diet forms of it, but it made it even worse. It made it taste really bad. So I found that the sugared versions of it, helped. And I hated giving them all that sugar because at this point I know more about the ketogenic diet, and I really didn't want to do that. But, I would add about 25% of the total to 25% ketone ester, and then 50% water was what I was doing. And he could drink it. He could at least drink it. It was like cranberry, grape, and orange flavors, were the 3 that we found worked pretty well. And but I frequently measured, like when we were trying to figure out how much to give him, I often did ketone levels there, with the monitors that you can get now. But I always checked his blood sugar level too. I just thought it would be interesting to see what happens. And even though he got sugar with the ketone ester, and even though he often ate like right after he got it, his blood sugar went down. It went down from where it was before we gave him the ketone ester.
On the ketone side, you were 0.3 on the coconut oil. What kind of ketone numbers were you seeing?
Yeah, we could easily get up to 5, 3, 4, 5 millimoles, depending on the dose that we were giving him. And so we ended up settling on, if we gave him 50 grams, it went up to 7. We're like, okay, that's way too high. That's actually on the border of ketoacidosis there, so we didn't want to do that. Luckily, when you give the ester, it does come down. It doesn't usually sustain at the high level for very long. But, so we found a dose, which was about 25 grams for him, that would put him around a 3.5 millimolar range.
Okay, so 25 grams of the active ingredient 3 times a day is what you were doing. And
right.
Sometimes with food?
Usually with food, I would say. Okay. There was probably 1 dose in the afternoon that wasn't with food, but usually 2 of the other times it would have been with breakfast and probably with dinner.
So how many years did he end up taking it, and how did it all, he did pass away. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah. So what happened with Steve, well, he ended up taking it from 2010 until he passed away in 2016. He, in 2013, June of 2013, he looked great. He had a caregiver that was staying with him, really nice lady. And I had to go off to work, and he kissed me goodbye, said he loved me. Everything seemed great. And 5 minutes later, I got a call from her that she had called 911 because he was having a horrible seizure, a really bad seizure. And she said that he fell back, hit his head, and just went into this seizure that lasted 20 minutes. And he stopped breathing. He turned blue. She was having to shake him to keep him breathing. And when I got home, he was still blue and he just wasn't breathing very well. And EMS got there right after I did and put oxygen on him. And then I found out later that he had another seizure on the way to the hospital. So he had, fell back, and he had a head injury with this, and it changed everything. It changed everything. And after that, he became dependent. He was in a wheelchair and he had to be fed, and he still interacted with us, but he couldn't talk very much. He could, and he seemed to understand us pretty well, but he couldn't really talk back and communicate with us very well. And so it was really a tragedy. And, I can only imagine if he didn't have the seizures, I don't know. The question is, would I still have him with me here today? I don't know. But it really completely changed everything. And we did keep the ketone ester going, and, of course, the coconut and MCT oil part of his diet. And, other than the sugar he got in the ketone ester, he was really on a ketogenic diet. And his main carbs were vegetables. He loved vegetables, fortunately, and he would eat whatever we gave him. So he maintained really good nutrition. He didn't lose weight at all, but, so from the neck down, he was in like great shape, and, but his brain wasn't. And so Alzheimer's, he died from Alzheimer's disease. In the end, we kept him at home, and he died at home in hospice care.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for sharing that journey. So where can people just get your book on Amazon?
Right.
And hopefully at the local bookstore as well. And, that book goes into details of different types of, ketones and more about the ketogenic diet. And it's an upgrade from your book that you wrote 5 years ago. So I hope you very much success with that, new book.
Thank you. It's more broadly about ketones, many more applications. The keto diet's really big right now. And so basically teaching people, a lot of people are confused. They think it's just a low carb diet. They don't realize it's also a high fat diet. And a lot of people that say they're doing keto probably aren't in ketosis at all. So there's history, there's evolution, there are interviews with 16 different pioneers and rising stars, and then how to do the diet, and all about ketone supplements, questions and answers, precautions, things people need to know about them, that information that might not be readily available. And then I do have more information on my website that I've had for years. I started this website right at the end of 2008 to try to get information to people with Alzheimer's about this idea of ketones as an alternative fuel for the brain. So that one's called coconutketones.com, COCONUTKETONES.com. And I have a lot of articles I've written up that people can print out for free about, all the different,
information to send to information to show your doctor, because obviously you want your doctor to be involved in this, and some doctors have no idea. So you're
no idea. They've never heard of it, some of them. So I put together information about ketone supplements and what kind of issues there could be, like it will lower your blood sugar. If you're diabetic and you're on insulin, you need to know that. You need to be monitoring, so that kind of information is on there. People taking diuretics or taking potassium, they need to know these things. And so I wrote it in such a way that the person themselves can understand it, but they can take it to their doctor, and it will give advice to their doctor on what needs to be monitored, while they're taking, any kind of ketone supplement.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Just amazing story. And I hope you will continue to spread the word.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you so much for having me on.